Welcome everyone, this is Manish Jha. We are taking the second chapter of Class 12 Political Science, which is the end of bipolarity. Let's take the overview first. Germany, divided after the Second World War, was unified. The Soviet Union stood by as the Cold War began to end, not by military means, but as a result of mass actions by ordinary men and women. In this chapter, we discuss the meaning, the causes, and the consequences of disintegration of the Second World War. We also discuss what happened to that part of the world after the collapse of communist regimes and how India relates to these countries now. Another topic is what was Soviet system. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic (USSR) came to into being after the Socialist Revolution in Russia in 1917. The revolution inspired by the ideas of socialism as opposed to capitalism and need for an egalitarian society. The biggest attempt in human history to abolish the institution of private property and consequently design a society based on principle of equality. The Soviet political system centered around the Communist Party or oppositions not allowed. The economy was planned and controlled by state. After the Second World War, the East European countries that the Soviet army had liberated from the fascist force came under the control of the USSR. The political and economic system of all these countries were modeled after the USSR. This group of countries was called the Second World or the Socialist Bloc. Soviet Union became a great power after the Second World War. Soviet Union had a complex communication network, vast energy resources including oil, iron and steel, machinery productions and a transport sector that connected its remotest areas with efficiency. It had a domestic consumer industry that produced everything from pin to car, though their quality did not match that of the Western capitalist country. Soviet Union (USSR) concerned about ordinary peoples to ensure a minimum standard of living for all citizens. Second, the government subsidies basic necessities including health, childcare, education, and other welfare schemes. There was no unemployment. State ownership was the dominant form of ownership. Land and productive assets were owned and controlled by the Soviet state. The Soviet system, however, became a very bureaucratic and authoritarian, making life very difficult for its citizens. Lack of democracy and absence of freedom of speech stifled people who often expressed their dissents in jokes and cartoons. The one-party system represented by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had tight control over all institutions and was unaccountable to the people. The party refused to recognize the urge of people in the 15 different republics that formed the Soviet Union to manage their own affairs, including their cultural affairs. In the arms races, the Soviet Union managed to match the US from time to time, but at great cost. The Soviet Union lagged behind the West in technology, infrastructure, and the most important in fulfilling the political and economic aspirations of citizens. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 weakened the system even further. Through wages continued to grow, productivity and technology fell considerably behind that of the best. This led to a shortage in all consumer goods. Food imports increased every year. The Soviet economy was faltering the late 1970s and became stagnant. Gorbachev and the disintegration. This was another topic. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had become general of the USSR in 1985, shoved to reform this system. Reforms necessary to keep the USSR abreast of the information and technological revolution taking place in the West. However, Gorbachev devised a division to normalize relations with the West and democratize and reforms the USSR had become other effects that neither be nor anyone else intended or anticipated. Soviet Union under Gorbachev did not intervene when the distribution occurred and the communist regimes collapsed one after another. Developments were accompanied by a rapidly escalating crisis within the USSR that hastened its disintegration. Gorbachev entitled the policies of economic and political reforms and democratization within the country. The reforms were opposed by leaders within the Communist Party. A coup took place in 1991 that was encouraged by Communist Party hardlines. The people tasted freedom by then and did not want the old-style rules of the Communist Party. Boris Yeltsin emerged as a national hero opposing this coup. The Russian Revolution, the Russian Republic, where Yeltsin won a popular election, began to shake off the centralized control. Central Asian republics did not ask for independence and wanted to remain with the Soviet Federation. In December 1991, Ukraine and Belarus, Russia, also three major republics of the USSR declared that the Soviet Union was disbanded. Capitalism and democracy were adopted as the basis for the post-Soviet republics. Declaration on the disintegration of the USSR and the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was known as CIS, came as a surprise to the other republics, especially to the Central Asian ones. Russia now accepted all the international treaties and the commitments of the Soviet Union. Old Soviet Union was thus dead and buried. Another topic was Another question was mainly asked by people that why did the Soviet Union disintegrate? Some of the reasons are internal weaknesses of Soviet Union political and economic institutions which failed to meet the aspirations of the people. Economic stagnation for many years serves consumer shortage and a large sections of Soviet society began to doubt and question the systems and to do so openly. The Soviet economy used much of its resources in maintaining nuclear and military arsenals and the development of its satellites states in Eastern Europe and within the Soviet system. This led to huge economic burden that the system could not cope with. At the same time, ordinary citizens became more knowledgeable about the economic advancement of the West. After years of being told that Soviet system was better than Western capitalism, the reality of its backwardness came as a political and psychological shock. The Soviet Union had become stagnant in an administrative and political sense as well. Worse still, the party bureaucrats gained more privileges than ordinary citizens. Gorbachev reforms promised to deal with these problems. Gorbachev carried out his reforms and loosed the system and set in motion force and expectations that few could have predicted and became virtually impossible to control. Soviet society felt that Gorbachev should have moved much faster and were disappointed and impatient with his method. They did not benefit in the way they had hoped or they benefited slowly. In the tug of war, Gorbachev lost support on all sides and became divided public options. Even those who were with him became disillusioned as they felt that he did not adequately defend his own policies. The rise of nationalism and the desire of sovereignty within various republics, including Russia and Baltic republics, Ukraine, Georgia, and other proved to be the final and most immediate cause of the disintegration of the USSR. One view of nationalism urges and feelings were very much at work throughout the history of the Soviet Union, and that whether or not the reforms had occurred, these would have been internal struggles within the Soviet Union. Other things that Gorbachev reforms speeded up and increased nationalism dissatisfaction to the point that the government and rurals not control it. Ironically, during the Cold War, many thought that nationalist unrest would be strongest in the Central Asian republics, given Asian ethnic and religious differences within the rest of the Soviet Union and their economic backwardness. Ordinary people here felt alienated from the Central Asian and from each others, and concluded also that they were paying too high on economic prices to keep the more backward areas within the Soviet Union. Another outcome was consequences of disintegration. The collapse of the Soviet world of the Soviet Union and the socialist system in Eastern Europe has profound consequences for world politics. That the ideological disputes over whether the socialist systems would beat the capitalism was not an issue anymore. The collapse of the Soviet Union and socialist system in Eastern Europe has profound consequences for world politics. The ideological dispute over whether the socialist system would beat the capitalist was not an issue anymore since the dispute had engaged the military of the two blocs, had triggered a massive arms race and accumulation of nuclear weapons, and had led to the existence of military blocs. The end of the confrontation demanded an end to this arms race and a possible new peace. The end of the Cold War left open only two possibles: the remaining superpowers would dominate and create a unipolar system, Different countries or groups of countries could become important players in the international system, thereby bringing in a multipolar system where no one power could dominate. Result of this, the US became the sole superpower. The US, the capitalist economy, was now the dominant economic system in the world. Third, the end of the Soviet bloc meant the emergence of many new countries. All these countries had their own independent aspirations and choices. The Central Asian countries wanted to take advantage of their geographical locations and continue their close ties with the West, the US, China and others. Shock therapy in post-communist regimes. Process of transition from an authoritarian socialist system to a democratic capitalist system. The model of transition in Russia, Central Asia and East Europe that was influenced by the World Bank and the IMF came to be known as shock therapy. Shock therapy varied in intensity and speed amongst the former Soviet world countries, but its directions and features were quite similar. It meant that private ownerships was to be the dominant pattern of own ownerships and property. The transition ruled out any alternate and or the third way other than state-controlled socialism or capitalism. Shock therapy also involved a drastic change in the external orientation of the organization economies, developments and invasion through more trades, and thus a sudden and complete switch to free trade was considered essential. The free trade regimes and foreign direct investment, which was known as FDI, moved to wanted to be the main engine of changes. This also involved openness to foreign policy investment, financial openings of the degradation, and the currently govern. Another topic was consequences of shock therapy. The shock therapy administered in the 1990s did not wanted to lead the people into promised utopia of mass consumption. Generally, it brought ruin to the economies and disaster upon the peoples of the entire region. In Russia, the large state-controlled industrial complex almost collapsed as about 90% of its industries were put up for sale to private individuals and companies. Since the restructuring was carried out through market forces and not by government-directed industrial policies, it led to virtual disappearance of entire industrial. This was called the largest garage sale in history. As valuable industries were underdeveloped and sold off throwaway prices, most citizens sold their vouchers in the black market because they needed the money. Collective farm system disintegrated, leaving peoples without food security, and Russia started to import foods. The real GDP of Russia in 1999 was below what it was in 1989. The old trading structure broke down within no alternative in its place. Russia had a strong executive president with the widest position of powers that rendered elections parliament relatively weak. In Central Asia, the president had a great power and several of them became very authoritarian. Most of these economies, especially Russia, started reviving in 2010 years after their independence. The reason for the revival for most of their economies was the export of natural resources like oil, natural gas, and minerals. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan are major oil and gas producers. Other countries have again become of the oil pipelines that cross their territories for which they get rent. Some amount of manufacturing has started. Tensions and conflicts. Most of the former Soviet republics are prone to conflicts and many have had civil wars and insurgents. In Russia, two republics, Chechnya and Dagestan, have had violent secessionist movements. Moscow's method of dealing with the Chechnya rebels and indiscriminate military bombing which lead to human right violation but failed to deter the aspiration of independence. In Central Asia, Tajikistan witnessed a civil war that went on the 10 year till 2001. Many movements against the existing regimes in Ukraine, uh, Kazakhstan, and Georgia countries have provinces are fighting over the right water. Ethnic Serbs, this and Masari of non-Serb Bosnians follow the NATO intervention in the bombing of Yugoslavia, followed the inter-ethnic civil wars. India and post-communist countries. India has maintained good relations with all the post-communist countries, but the strongest relations are still those between Russia and India. Russia and India store a vision of a multipolar world politics. More than 80 bilateral agreements have been signed between India and Russia as part of the Indo-Russian Strategic Agreement of 2001. India stands to benefit from its relationships with Russia on issues like Kashmir, energy supply, sharing information or international terrorism, access to Central Asia, and balancing in relation with China. Russia stands to benefit from this relation because India is the second largest arms market for Russia. Indian military gets most of its handwares from Russia's since India is an oil importing nation. Russia is important for India's nuclear energy plans and the assassinated India space industry by giving. With this, we have come to an end of this chapter. I hope you found this video informative. Till then, catch you guys in the next video. Thank you.